Hello. Hey guys. What's up, Daniel? What's up, Dee Dee? Hey, Hope. How's it going? What's up, Nikki? Nice of you to join. Hey, Katie. Glad you could join. What is up, Bigfoot? Yeah, why do you have that font for your name, Bigfoot? It's very hard to read. So apparently the Olympics are over or are about to be over. That was quick. Yeah, I barely pay attention to I barely pay attention the entire 2-3 weeks that it's been happening. How did the US do? Did we win a lot? How did we do? What's up, Father Anderson? Hey, Caleb. Nice of you to join. What's up, Daniel Rafael Diaz? I will give you a shout out. Hey, Petri. Or Petri? How did we do? Olympics gold medals. US? It's only 2.5 weeks though. Oh, we're doing. Oh, we did really well. Hold on. We're number 1 in medals, gold medals and medals overall. Hey, we're pretty good, right? How did Vietnam do? Let me see. Come on, Vietnam. Olympics medals. Oh no! Oh no! We got 0. What the fuck? We're terrible. Your country was doing well? What is your country? Oh no. What a poor showing. Yeah, we usually don't do that well. Vietnam usually it's pretty much dead last. Oh well. Hey, that's a Vietnamese person. Look. Oh, another Vietnamese person. Philippines. Are the Philippines in the Olympics? Let's see. Philippines. Oh, there you go. You guys got 4 medals and 1 gold. Good job. Did better than Vietnam. What is my favorite hentai? Okay. I don't know. I don't watch that stuff, you guys. Not a degenerate. The video is a bit choppy. Let's hope it doesn't stay that way. Okay. Look what I have today. Oh, shit. I guess they call it bourbon biscuits. I don't know if there's actually any bourbon in there, but we'll see. Do you guys like those liquor-filled chocolates? Like those chocolates with that are filled with liquor? Those are really good. This is not those. Even though it says bourbon. Ugh. It kind of has an alcohol smell. No, it's just chocolate. It's like a cracker with chocolate inside. That's it. Yeah, pretty good. I don't know why they call it bourbon though. Rated out of 10. It's gonna be a 7 out of 10 for me. 7 out of 10. The chocolate is a bit soft, but I don't think that's its fault. I think it's just really hot around here, so yeah, a solid 7 out of 10. Very satisfying. All right. So today's chapter it's a pretty important chapter, okay? It's a shit happens, shit goes down in this chapter, so be prepared. What is the next topic you're going to focus on? I can't tell you that. I think we're gonna continue with the Kamakura period, and then I'll have some other stuff. I have some other stuff planned. Yeah. I pretty much have a gigantic to-do list of topics that apparently it doesn't seem like I'm gonna run out anytime soon. So there's a lot of potential topics. Yeah. So whenever people like ask me to do like suggest topics to me, if it's a good topic, then I'll add it to the list. So it's a long list right now. It's multiple pages of just like lines of topics to do. Yeah. So whenever I want to do a new one, I'll just look at that list and I'll be like, which one sounds like it's really interesting, and then I'll do research on it. What does my cup say? It says, who isn't dopey in the mornings? And then if you turn it around, there's a picture of Dopey, the dwarf. Yeah, I got this from, guess where I got it from? Dun, 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 dun. Maybe I'm supposed to drink bourbon with them? Oh, maybe. Damn it, I don't have any. All right, so what happened last week? All right, what happened in the last chapter? So last chapter, remember, they're on, they've united the 5 sword schools, right? And they've agreed to have a martial arts competition to decide who's the leader. So, Yue Lingshan challenges the masters of 3 schools in the last chapter. So she defeated the masters of the Taishan school using Taishan sword techniques, right? And Ling Hucheng sees this and he's like, oh my god, how does she know Taishan sword techniques? And he figures out that, she must have found the cave on the top of the Mount of Contemplation, right? Just like he did. And so if she knows about it, then his master must know about it too. So that's how she knows. So she must have learned from the cave, and she's using these techniques to defeat the masters of these schools, right? So it looks like she's really good. So she defeats the people of Taishan, and then Mr. Moda of the Hangshan school comes in, challenges her, and they start fighting, and she defeats him too. Now, the only reason she won because Mr. Moda had mercy on her, right? And then she took advantage of it. So he stopped attacking, and then he was like, oh, he was extending his hand to help her up, but then she takes advantage of that and she wounds him, right? And then she defeats him. So she wins against Mr. Moda, and then Ling Hu Chong, our hero, challenges her, intending to let her win, right? So he wants to let her win. He challenges her. So they start fighting using Hangshan sword techniques. During the fight, they start remembering, they start reminiscing about the old days, and they start using moves from the Chongling sword art, which was something that they created as kids. They were very lovey-dovey as kids, right? So they created their own sword techniques, and they start fighting with it during the fight, right? So it's basically flirting by sword, right? Remember, she's married at this moment, and her husband is watching them flirt by sword at the moment, and Ying Ying is also in the audience, and she's watching what's happening, right? So they start doing this stuff. In the middle of it, Ling Hu Chong accidentally flicks her sword into the air, and it flies into the air. And he's like, "Oh shit! I wanted to lose. If I do that, then she loses, and I win, right?" So the sword flies into the air, and then he steps into the sword's path, and he lets it impale him, making him lose, right? Making him lose the fight. And he's wounded bad. There's a lot of blood coming out. Yeah, and then the people watching this fight, they figured that if Yue Lingshan could defeat the masters of all these schools using their own techniques, then her father, her father, who is Yue Buchun, he must be even better, right? So everyone's thinking, oh, Yue Buchun should be the leader of the new united school. And yeah, basically that's it. That was a recap. How's that? Hentai books in the Edo period. The tentacle. Oh, yeah. They're called shunga. They're very explicit wood block prints. Yeah, and there's one with the octopus, I believe. Yeah, that's a good video to do. I think I'm gonna do that. That's probably in the future. I don't know if I'm gonna do it right now, but if I do that video, it's gonna be a lot of explicit pictures. So I don't know how I'm going to do that. Their sword tips touch. Yeah. He's such a sap, I swear to God. He's totally such a sap. He's totally still in love with her. Thinking with his sword. That's funny. Did I get that mug from Home Goods? No, this is from Disneyland. I went to Disneyland. No, sorry. Disney World. I went to Disney World once, and I got this. So, yeah. All right. Shall we get started? Let's do this. All right, so remember, Ling Hu Chong just got hurt, right? He just got wounded. All right. Chapter 34, Snatching the Leadership. The crowd was commenting on what they had seen when a loud and clear voice said, Huashan School, under the careful study of Mr. Yue, has thoroughly understood the sword arts from Taishan, Hangshan, and Hangshan schools. Not only has he understood them, he has actually perfected them, and this really makes other people admire him. If Mr. Yue doesn't take up this headmaster position of the Five Mountains School, then there's no one else we can choose. The person who spoke was wearing a ragged and soiled gown. He was the leader of the beggar clan, Xie Feng. Fang Zhang, Chongshu, and he had the same thought that harm would come upon Wulin once Zuo Langchan merged the 5 mountain sword schools, and that sooner or later trouble would come upon the beggar clan. He also thought that it was better for the refined gentleman Yue Buchun to be the 5 mountain schools' headmaster than the wildly ambitious Zuo Langchan. How many ounces does the mug hold? How am I supposed to know? I don't know. It holds enough for me to drink. Ever since Beggar Clan existed in Jianghu, they had always been very powerful. Hearing what the Beggar Clan leader said, the common people didn't dare to rashly object to his words. Suddenly, a deep and cold voice said, Miss Yue is proficient. Miss Yue is proficient in Taishan, Hangshan, and Hangshan school sword arts. This is really commendable. If you can use Songshan's sword art to win against my sword, then the whole Songshan school will accept Mr. Yue as the headmaster. The one who said this was, of course, Zuo Langchan. As he talked, he had walked up to the middle of the courtyard with his left hand gripping his sword scabbard. With a ringing sound, his long sword jumped out of the scabbard, and with a flicker of light, the long sword hovered in midair. He extended his right hand and grabbed the sword's handle. This move was extremely pleasing to the eye. With a grip of his left hand, he used his internal energy to force the long sword out. This kind of deep internal energy was rarely seen or heard of. Of course, the disciples of Songshan School cheered loudly, and the heroes from the other schools also applauded thunderously. I'll only use 13 moves. If within these 13 moves I can't win against martial uncle Zuo, Yue Lingshan replied. Zuo Langchan angrily thought, You little girl dare to openly receive my swordplay? How daring. You even put a limit of 13 moves, so you regard me as if I'm nothing. He then coldly said, If you can't best me within 13 moves, then what? How can I be Martial Uncle Zuo's match? I've only learned 13 moves of the Songshan School's sword art from my father. Martial Uncle Zuo can verify this with your own hand. Zuo Langchan snorted. Yue Lingshan continued. My father said that even though these 13 moves are Songshan School's brilliant sword art, when I use them, he's afraid that in just one move, my sword would be shaken out of my hands by Martial Uncle Zuo, and it'll be impossible for me to even get to the second move. Zuo Langchan again snorted and didn't express his opinion. This guy likes snorting. When Yue Lingshan first started talking, her voice was trembling. Whether it was because her strength was depleted, or because she was facing such a big hero in Wulin, and became afraid, no one knew. But as she continued talking, her voice gradually calmed. She went on, I said to Dad, Martial Uncle Zuo is without question Songshan School's #1 master, but he's not necessarily the #1 master in our 5 mountain sword schools. His martial art is high, but he may not necessarily be proficient in all the 5 mountain sword school sword arts like you, Dad. My dad then said, this word proficient, it's easier said than done. All I know is some basic skills only. If you don't believe me, you can fight against Martial Uncle Zuo once you've learned this kind of 3-legged cat skills of Songshan School sword art. If you can fight against Martial Uncle Zuo's earth-shattering Songshan sword art for more than 3 moves, then I'll praise you as my good daughter. Zuo Langchan laughed coldly and said, If you defeat me within 3 moves, then you'll become an even better daughter for Mr. Yue. Martial Uncle Zuo's sword art is godly, and talent such as yours has rarely been seen in hundreds of years at the Songshan School. I had only learned a few moves of the sword art from my father, and I just did that recently. How can I dare to think such wild thoughts? Father told me to receive 3 moves from martial Uncle Zuo, but I am foolishly deluded to hope I can receive 13 moves of your sword art. However, I don't know whether I can fulfill my wish or not. Zuo Langshan thought, don't say 13 moves. If I let you go beyond 3 moves, then I already have no face to show anymore. He lifted his left hand and extended his thumb, forefinger, and middle finger to grab the point of his sword. Holding the sword point, he then suddenly let go of the long sword from his right hand, and like a string plucked, the sword handle shot forward and swayed. Make your move. With this stunt, Zuo Langchan created a sensation throughout the crowd. Not only was he using his unfavored left hand to use the sword, he was also holding the sword by gripping the point with 3 fingers, while the sword handle faced the opponent. Okay, so he's using his other hand, his left hand, right, his non-dominant hand, and he's grabbing the sword by the point. So he's fighting with the sword handle facing the opponent. So he's giving her a handicap. Compared to fighting a naked blade with bare hands, fighting with a sword gripped at the sword point by 3 fingers was 10 times more difficult. Receiving a slight shake to the sword might slash his fingers, and if this happened, how would he still be able to hold onto the sword and use it? It was obvious that Zuo Langchan was greatly indignant and was showing complete disdain towards Yue Lingshan by using such method. In addition, he deliberately shocked everyone with his marvelous skill. Seeing him holding his sword this way, Yue Lingshan trembled. She thought, what kind of martial art is he using? Daddy didn't teach me anything like this. And fear started to grow in her heart. She also thought, since it has come to this, what's the use of being afraid? With this last thought, she quickly glanced towards the crowd of Hangshan School disciples. She saw that they were still in a circle, but she didn't hear any crying. She guessed that although Ling Huchong's injury was serious, his life wasn't threatened. She raised her long sword above her head and bowed. This was the move called the whole sword facing the ancestors, which was an original sword art from Songshan. The meaning of this sword move was to show respect. Songshan's disciples burst into cheers, feeling quite pleased. Whatever Songshan disciples were about to train moves with the school's seniors, they must use this move first. Whenever Songshan disciples were about to trade moves with the school's seniors, they must use this move first. The meaning was they wouldn't dare to fight with the senior, but were instead asking for some pointers. Zuo Langchan nodded slightly and thought, how unexpected that you can use this move. Finally, you're being clever in showing me it. I won't let you be too shamed then. After Yue Lingshan had finished using the move, the whole school facing the ancestors, with a flash, her longsword changed into a white rainbow as it thrust towards Zuo Langchan. This move looked really grand, and it was precisely the essence of the Songshan school's sword art. Even though Zuo Langchan was well educated in the Songshan sword art of inside 8 groups, outside 9 groups, and in these 17 groups, he knew very well the length and speed of each sword art group. He had never seen this move before. He was greatly startled and thought, what move is this? From my Songshan school's 17 sword art groups, it seemed none of them is higher in level than this one. This is strange. Not only was he a great master in Songshan, he was also a great scholar of martial study of this generation. So once he saw his own school's grand and mysterious sword move, he wanted to see it clearly. He saw Yue Lingshan's attack was coming, but her internal energy wasn't powerful. So once her sword came to a few inches from his body, he could just shook it out of her hand. But if he did that, he wouldn't be able to see whether there were more strange changes in the moves after this one. Oh, Jackie, you're Vietnamese too? Hey, so am I. Hey, fellow Vietnamese person. As soon as Yue Lingshan's attack came to a foot of his chest, she withdrew her sword, slanted her body, circled her longsword, and slashed down towards his left shoulder. This move looked like Songshan School's sword art called Wise Man Throughout the Ages, but Wise Man Throughout the Ages was faster, even though it was not as grand. It also looked like the move Floating Kingfisher, but lighter and not as grand as Floating Kingfisher. It also looked a bit like Jade Well Heaven Pond, but Jade Well Heaven Pond looked more impressive and dignified. When this move was used by Yue Lingshan, it had an air of elegance about it. Zuo Lengchan had keen eyesight, and he had immersed himself in the study of the Songshan School's sword art for his entire life. The fineness and the advantages of every move and every stance, the smallest details of every complicated point, were all engraved in his mind. Now that he suddenly saw how Yue Lingshan's move contained the strong points of the many big moves of the Songshan sword art, while looking like it covered the weak points of those sword plays, he couldn't help feeling excited, amazed, and happy, just as if he had seen a treasure falling down from the sky. Years ago on Mount Huashan, the 5 mountains sword schools fought twice with 10 elders from the Devil sect and lost quite a number of masters. Many unique skills from the 5 schools' sword arts also died together with these masters. Later, Zuo Langchan had gathered all the surviving elders from the Songshan school and recorded the sword moves from their memories, irrespective of their fineness, and completed a sword manual. In the last dozens of years at Wuchunqing, he had altered and improved moves which weren't fierce or grand enough to make the 17 groups of sword moves perfect. Even though he didn't create any new swordplay, he had rendered a great service by this arrangement of the Songshan sword arts. Now, seeing that Yue Lingshan had used Songshan's sword art that was not from the school's sword manual, and that seemed deeper compared to all the currently existing stances and moves of the Songshan sword art, he couldn't help being joyful and sighing in praise. If this sword art was being executed by a strong opponent, like Ron Wo-sing or Ling Hu-chong, or even Great Master Fang Zhang or Priest Chong-shu, Zuo Langshan would have to concentrate completely on fighting his opponent. Even if his opponent's sword moves were wonderful, he would have to cope with it with all of his power, that he would not have the leisure to look at the opponent's sword art. On the other hand, Yue Lingshan's shallow internal energy was nothing to be afraid of. In the event of a desperate situation, he could just shake the longsword out of her hand at any time and fight for real. For now, he continued observing the changes in her sword moves intently. So he's really not scared of her at all. He just wants to study these moves that she's using, because he's never seen them before. The crowd saw Yue Lingshan's longsword dancing about, each move a foot away from her opponent, looking like she was deliberately giving way, and looking as if she was afraid. Zuo Langchan, though, just stood while his face sometimes registered happiness and sometimes worry, as if he had lost his mind. This kind of martial art fighting had never been seen before. The crowd looked at each other, amazed. Only the disciples of the Songshan school were observing the fight intently, fearing they would miss seeing half a stance. Yue Lingshan had learned these few moves of the Songshan sword art from the engravings on the cave wall on the Cliff of Contemplation. Altogether, there were around 60 to 70 moves engraved on the wall. After Yue Buchun had studied them, he guessed that about 40 of them were most likely already known and used by Zuo Langchan, while the rest looked brilliant but seemed insufficient to move Zuo Langchan's heart. Only these 13 moves were certain to awe him and make him want to see them no matter what. The stances engraved on the cave wall were definitely dead, without possible variations, and Yue Lingshan only used them according to the movements engraved on the wall. But when Zuo Langchan saw them, he could imagine how all the moves could be used together, and as he thought more, the ways to use these moves seemed endless. Yue Lingshan capably used up all 13 moves and started from the beginning again for the 14th. Zuo Langshan thought, should I take a look again, or do I shake her longsword off? These two matters were very easy for him to do. If he wanted to continue watching, Even if the level of Yue Lingshan's swordplay were higher, she still wouldn't be able to hurt him. If he wanted to shake her longsword off, then all he had to do was lift his hand to do it. But to choose between these two choices was not easy at all. All of a sudden, many things popped up in his head. After this, I'm afraid there'll be no more chance to see these wonderful Songshan sword arts again. To kill this little girl is easy, but where can I see these sword arts again? How can I ask Mr. Yue for a demonstration? If I let her continue, it'll seem as if I can't contend with this little girl from Huashan. How can I keep my face after that? Ayo, she's done more than 13 moves. As he thought of the words 13 moves, the thought of becoming the leader of Wulin overpowered the idea of studying these martial arts. He flicked the 3 fingers on his left hand, and his sword shot up and hit Yue Lingshan's longsword, generating a continuously cracking sound. Afterwards, Yue Lingshan was left only with a sword handle and an inch of her sword blade, while dozens of broken pieces lay on the ground. Yue Lingshan jumped back and retreated for dozens of feet. Then, in a loud voice, said, "Martial Uncle Zuo, how many Songshan sword art moves did I use?" Zuo Longchan closed both of his eyes, thinking about those sword moves Yue Lingshan used. He recalled each move one by one, then opened his eyes and said, "You used 13 moves. Very good. It's not easy." Yue Lingshan bowed and cupped her fist. "Martial Uncle Zuo, thank you for your mercy in letting me show off my meager skills in using 13 sword moves of the Songshan sword art in front of you." The crowd sighed in admiration at the divine martial art Zuo Longchan used to break Yue Lingshan's longsword. But Yue Lingshan had declared before that she was going to use 13 moves in front of Zuo Longchan. The majority of the crowd thought it wouldn't be an easy thing to manage using 3 moves, let alone 13. But unexpectedly, Zuo Longchan had acted like a crazy person and let her execute up to the 14th move before striking out. Everyone was surprised, and there were people who thought wildly and believed Zuo Longchan was a pervert because his mind seemed to have gone blank in front of such a beautiful young woman as an opponent. From the Songshan School's cluster, a thin old person walked out. He was Crane Hands Lu Bai, and he said in a clear voice, "Headmaster Zuo's divine martial art is unrivaled. Everyone can see how elegant and open-minded he is. Now how absurd of this Miss Yue to show off some basic skills of my Songshan School sword arts in front of him. Headmaster Zuo merely waited for her to exhaust her skills before subduing her. In the martial arts study, it's quality over quantity. So, no matter which sex or which school's martial art you're using, you must practice them until you reach the pinnacle of that martial art, and only then can you stand in Wulin." He only said till here when the crowd started nodding their heads. These words had touched directly at the thoughts of each person here. These men of Jianghu, besides a few masters here, had actually only learned the martial art of one school. So when Lu Bai said it was quality over quantity in the study of martial art, they all approved of it. But whether these people actually had quality enough in their own martial art, it was very difficult to say. On the other hand, it could certainly be said that these people did not know a large quantity of martial arts. Lu Bai went on, "This Miss Yue is quite smart. When other schools were practicing their swordplay, she secretly peeped in and stole some sword moves, then praised herself to be proficient in the 5 mountain sword schools' sword arts. Actually, each school's martial art has its own secret that's passed down personally by the masters. If you only peeped into the moves of each stance, then how can you say that you're proficient in them?" The crowd again nodded their heads, and they all thought Stealing other schools' martial art is Wulin's biggest taboo. The consequence of this will definitely fall on Yue Chun's head. That old person continued, how can you praise yourself to be proficient in other schools' martial art if all you did was peek at other people's wonderful stances and learned it yourself? Did you learn yourself that school's martial arts secret? If not, then how can it be that if not, then how can that be a highly wonderful move? I steal yours, you steal mine. Wouldn't that be chaotic? Right after he finished saying this, many people in the crowd burst into laughter. Yue Lingshan had used the Hangshan sword art to defeat Mr. Moda, and used Hangshan sword art to defeat Ling Hucheng. However, in both fights, it looked as if they had given way to her. But when she used Taishan's sword art to defeat Yu Qingzi and Yu Yinzi, she truly used real skills. She was actually proficient in the sword moves she used to fight Yu Qingzi and Yu Yinzi, and yet because she had attacked them when they were unprepared, it could still be said that she used her fine sword art in an opportunistic way to gain triumph. Even though she only pretended to know the move Daizhong Wei, besides the masters of the Taishan school, no one else knew of the sham. However, the crowd wasn't willing to acknowledge that outsiders could be proficient in the martial art of another school. So, when they heard what Lu Bai said, many people added their voice to the commotion created by the Songshan school disciples. When Lu Bai saw that his speech had gained the acknowledgement of the crowd, he looked pleased with himself and raised his voice to say, so, for this position of headmaster of the Five Mountain School, there's no one better than Headmaster Zuo to occupy it. Although it should be known to learn one type of martial art to its pinnacle is much better than learning a lot of martial art shallowly. When he said these words, they were clearly pointed at Yue Chun. Dozens of young disciples of the Songshan school cheered loudly at this. Lu Bai said, within the Five Mountain Sword Schools, if there's anyone who's confident of defeating Headmaster Zuo, then please come out and show us your skill. He turned around, but no one came up. Originally, the Peach Valley Six Fairies would surely have come out to talk nonsense, but at this time, Ying was worried about helping Ling Hucheng, so she didn't have the time to direct the Peach Valley Six Fairies in making trouble for the Songshan school. Root Fairy and his 5 brothers were looking at each other, but they couldn't come up with an idea on what was best to do. Tower Holding Palm, Ding Mian, shouted loudly, since no one wants to challenge Headmaster Zuo, Headmaster Zuo is favored by everyone here. Then we'll ask him to be our Five Mountain Schools' headmaster. Zuo Langchan feigned humility and said, there's an abundance of talented people in the Five Mountain School. I have no virtue and no ability. I don't deserve to take up this heavy responsibility. Songshan School's 7th protector, Tang Yingge, said clearly, the position of headmaster of the Five Mountain School is a high position and has heavy responsibility, but we have to push Headmaster Zuo into taking this difficult job so that the thousands of Five Mountain Schools' disciples have good fortune, and we can contribute greatly to the orthodox path in Jianghu. Headmaster Zuo, please become our leader. Suddenly, gongs and drums reverberated loudly, while firecrackers went off in succession. All these had been prepared beforehand by the Songshan School disciples. As the thunderous sound of firecrackers erupted, Songshan School disciples, along with the invited friends of Zuo Langchan, cried out, Headmaster Zuo, please ascend the throne! Headmaster Zuo, please ascend the throne! Alright, so he had all this planned, all the firecrackers and all the drums and stuff. Zuo Langchan leapt up and landed lightly on the top of the place of worship. Just then it was already dusk, and the sun was about to go down the mountain. As the setting sun shone slantingly on Zuo Langchan, the apricot yellow gown he was wearing glittered like gold and added to the grand atmosphere. He cupped his fist and turned his body around to greet the crowd below the place of worship. Since everyone is pushing me into it, if I don't agree to take on this difficult responsibility, it would seem like I was protecting my own reputation and was not willing to make a contribution to the orthodox path in Wulin. Several hundred people from the Songshan school thunderously cheered and applauded. Suddenly, a female voice interrupted. Martial Uncle Zuo, you broke my longsword, but just by breaking my sword, how can you become the headmaster of the Five Mountains School? The one who said this was Yue Lingshan. All the realms' heroes are here. Everyone said before that it was a sword competition to take the leadership. If Miss Yue can break the long sword in my hand like that, then everyone will accept Miss Yue to be the Five Mountain Schools' headmaster, Zuo Langchan said. Of course I can't win over Martial Uncle Zuo, but within our Five Mountain School, it is not necessarily true that there's no one whose martial art is better than Martial Uncle Zuo, Yue Lingshan replied. From among the people in the Five Mountains School, Ling Huchong was the only one Zuo Langchan was afraid of. Ever since Ling Huchong had gotten heavily injured after fighting against Yue Lingshan, Zuo Langchan had felt relieved and confident. Now, hearing her reply, he retorted, So, according to Miss Yue's opinion, within the Five Mountains, there's someone whose martial art can defeat me? Is this person your father, your mother, or your husband? Songshan School disciples exploded in laughter. Sounds like booming BGM in TV shows that indicate a big moment's about to happen. Oh, you mean the drums? Yeah. Something's about to happen. There's a drum roll. My husband is of a lower generation, so he must yield to Martial Uncle Zuo if he were to fight. My mother's sword art is well matched with Martial Uncle Zuo's, while my father, I think, his skills are slightly higher than Martial Uncle Zuo's, Yue Lingshan said. Songshan School disciples jeered at this. Some whistled loudly, while some stomped their feet on the ground. Zuo Langchan said to Yue Buchun, Mr. Yue, your daughter regards your martial art really highly. My little daughter can't... Well, they sound the same. My little daughter can't stop her mouth blabbering. Brother Zuo doesn't have to treat her seriously. My swordplay is nothing when compared to Shaolin School's Great Master Feng Zheng, Wudang School's Priest Chong Shu, and Beggar Clan's Leader Xie, Yue Buchun replied. Zuo Langchan's face changed color when he heard this. Yue Buchun had mentioned 3 names, but his name was not one of them. Clearly, Yue Buchun was praising himself to be better than Zuo Langchan in front of everyone. Ding Mian said, How about compared to Headmaster Zuo? Yue Buchun replied, Brother Zuo and I have known each other for many years, and we respect each other. Both Songshan and Huashan schools' sword arts are strong, and in the last hundreds of years, there has been no distinction on which one is higher, so it's very hard for me to answer Brother Ding's question. Judging from Mr. Yue's tone, it sounded like you believe yourself to be stronger than Headmaster Zuo, Bing Mian said. The master said, A gentleman has nothing to fight about, but if it must be, he will fight. Since ancient times, it's unavoidable to dispute over how high someone's martial art is. I've long harbored a wish to ask Martial Brother Zuo for pointers, but today is our new Five Mountain Schools' inauguration, and we haven't selected a headmaster yet. If Brother Zuo and I have a sword fight, then it'll look as if we're having a fight for the position of the Five Mountain Schools' headmaster. Then it'll be unavoidable for people to gossip, Yue Buchun said. Zuo Langchan said, If Brother Yue can win against this sword in my hand, Then Brother Yue will be the headmaster of the Five Mountains School. Yue Buchun waved his hand a few times and said, It's not necessarily true that a person with high martial arts will also have high moral behavior. If I manage to win against Brother Zuo, it'll not necessarily be true that I'd be able to win against the rest of the masters in the Five Mountains School. The way he said these words was very modest, but each meticulously said word proclaimed that he was a level higher, a level better than Zuo Langchan. Zuo Langchan got angrier the longer he listened. He coldly said, Brother Yue's reputation as gentleman's sword shakes the whole world. The word gentleman is well known to everyone, but this word sword, we've heard of it a lot, but we've rarely seen it. Today, as the entire world's heroes have gathered here, I'll have to ask Brother Yue to show your brilliant sword art, so as to let everyone here open their eyes. Many people called out, Go up and fight! Go up and fight! All talk and no action. What kind of hero is that? Go and have a sword fight. Decide which one is stronger. What's the use of boasting? Yue Buchun put both of his hands behind his back and stayed silent. His expression was solemn and respectful. There was a hint of worry in his face. When Zuo Langchan was planning to merge the Five Mountain Sword Schools, he had already known the martial arts of each master from the other 4 schools, and was confident that no one from those schools would be able to win against him. So he did his utmost to push this merger through. Otherwise, if there was someone with a more powerful martial art than him, then after the merger of the 5 schools, this position of headmaster might be snatched by other people. If that happened, wouldn't that be benefiting other people instead? Yue Buchun's swordplay was brilliant, and his attainment of the divine art of Violet Twilight was also not low. Both of these things were well known to Zuo Langchan. Thus, Zuo Langchan incited Feng Buping, Cheng Buyo, and the other masters from the sword branch to go up Mount Huashan, and he also sent more than 10 other good fighters from other schools to attack Yue Buchun at the God of Medicine Monastery. Although they failed, they managed to gather in detail the level of Yue Buchun's martial art. After Zuo Langchan personally saw Yue Buchun fighting against Ling Huchong at the Shaolin Temple, he became even more at ease. Even though Yue Buchun's sword art was wonderful, he was still not Zuo Langchan's match. When Yue Buchun kicked Ling Huchong, he even got his right leg broken. That showed his internal energy cultivation was just mediocre. But as for this little kid, Ling Huchong, he seemed to have suddenly advanced greatly in his sword art, which was really beyond his expectation. But he couldn't always be afraid of this loafer and just give up this big matter that he had been planning for tens of years already. Moreover, Ling Huchong's strong point was only in his swordplay, while his bare-hand martial art was very ordinary. If they were to fight for real and he couldn't win by his swordplay, then he would use his fist and palm at the same time, and he could immediately take Ling Huchong's life then. However, all his anxiety left completely when he saw Ling Huchong had gotten himself willingly injured under Yue Lingshan's sword. Now, hearing the Yue father and daughter speaking so boastfully, he thought, I don't know how you did it, but you've studied the lost unique skills of the Five Mountain Sword Schools, and now got yourself deluded over this. If you, Yue Buchun, were fighting me, and suddenly used these moves, you would have intimidated me, but it was the wrong move to let your daughter use them first. Now I'm already prepared for them. What's the use of using them again? He also thought, this person is very calculating and careful. If I can beat him up good and proper in front of all these heroes here, then he won't be cocky anymore. Otherwise, he'll remain in my five mountain school and be a big trouble for the future. So he said, Brother Yue, all the world's heroes have already asked you to go up and show your skill. How can you not give them face? Since Brother Zuo said it, I'll have to respectfully obey your order, Yue Buchun replied, and then step by step he walked up the place of worship. Thinking there was a good show to be seen, the crowd cheered happily. Yuebuchun folded his hands in salute and said, Brother Zuo, we're now under the same school, so we'll just stop at skin deep when comparing our skills. What do you think? Brother, you must definitely be careful. I'll do my best to not injure Brother Yue, Zuo Longchan replied. The people from the Songshan school called out, You haven't fought yet, but you've already asking for mercy. It's better not to fight then. The blade isn't born with eyes. Once it moves, who can guarantee you won't be harmed or killed? If you're afraid, then be clever and accept defeat and descend from the fight courtyard. It's not too late. Yebuchun smiled and said clearly, The blade isn't born with eyes. Once it moves, it's difficult to avoid death or injuries. These words are right. He then turned his head towards Huashan school disciples and said, Disciples of Huashan, listen to me. Martial brother Zuo and I are going to compare skills. There's no enmity in this. If martial brother Zuo slips and kills me or heavily injures me, that's just because the battle was too fierce and it's not easy to stop an inch away. No one must hate martial uncle Zuo for this, and you must also not seek revenge on the people from the Songshan school so that you don't ruin the loyalty within our 5 mountain school. Yue Lingshan and everyone else acknowledged him loudly. Zuo Langshan didn't expect him to talk like this, so he said, Brother Yue understands about righteousness very deeply. The loyalty within our school is most important. That's very good. So he says if one person kills another, then his followers must not take revenge, right? Yuebuchun smiled and said, The merger of our 5 schools into one was the most difficult thing to do. If the peace of the 5 mountain schools is harmed because of the 2 of us comparing our sword techniques, and inner fighting between martial brothers in the 5 mountain schools occurred, then that'll be counter to the original meaning of merging the schools. Right, Zuo Langchan agreed, while he thought, This person is very timid. I should take advantage of this and subdue him now. When masters fight, the internal strength and movements were very important, but winning and losing was often decided by the strength of will. Zuo Langchan secretly felt happy that Yue Buchun was showing a weakness. With a ringing sound, he drew his longsword out. When the longsword cleared the scabbard, the sound unexpectedly reverberated throughout the whole valley. Zuo Langchan had moved his inner energy in a unique way so that the edge of the sword struck the inner wall of the sheath continuously as it came out of its sheath and emitted a thunderous ringing sound. The people who didn't know the reason for this were astonished greatly. The people from Songshan school again cheered loudly. On the other hand, Yue Buchun pulled out his longsword along with its scabbard from his waist. Then he freed the sword from its sheath and slowly and silently pulled it out. Judging from the way these 2 people pulled their swords out, it could be said that this sword fight was between a master and a novice. It looked as if the outcome was already certain, that there was no need for a fight. Ling Huchong's shoulder blade was pierced by the longsword, which penetrated all the way to the front as a result, and as a result, he suffered a heavy injury. After witnessing Ling Huchong getting injured, Yingying became really worried, and without caring about her disguise, she rushed forward with her longsword raised to protect him. Once the Hangshan school disciples had surrounded him, Yihe took out the White Cloud Bear gallbladder pill and nervously spilled out 5 to 6 pills and put them in Ling Huchong's mouth. Yingying had already sealed the acupoints on his chest and on his back to stop the bleeding quite some time ago. Yiqing and Zheng E separately applied the heaven-connecting glue on his wound. When it was their headmaster who was injured, how could the disciples be stingy in using the medicine? They weren't afraid to apply ample amounts of medicine. In fact, They regarded this priceless medicine like it was just mud as they applied it thickly on his wound. Even though Ling Huchang's injury was serious, he was still clear-headed. When he saw how Ying Ying and the Hangshan school disciples were deeply concerned for him, he felt apologetic. Just because I wanted to make little martial sisters smile, I made Ying Ying and martial sisters from Hangshan school worried to death. He immediately smiled and said, I don't know how. I got careless and I got injured. Don't worry. Don't worry. No need. No need. Don't say anything, Ying Ying rebuked. Even though she tried her best to sound coarse, it was still very hard to cover up her feminine voice. All the disciples of the Hangshan school were stunned to hear this bearded man having a tender and soft voice. Ling Huchang said, Let me have a look. Yes, Yi Qing answered, and pulled her two martial sisters, who were in front of his body, to the side to let him watch Yue Lingshan's fight with Zuo Langchan. Ling Huchang saw Yue Lingshan using Songshan's sword art, Zuo Langchan breaking her sword, and finally Zuo Langchan and Yue Buchun facing each other for a fight on top of the place of worship. All these he observed vaguely. With his long sword pointed to the ground, Yue Buchun turned around to face Zuo Langchan with a smile on his face. At this time, they were around 20 feet away from each other. The crowd was holding their breath, and the whole Songshan mountaintop was deathly quiet. But Ling Huchang heard a really faint voice reciting a scripture. If fierce beasts surrounded you and you were frightened by their sharp teeth and claws, you would call Bodhisattva Guanyin's name and all the beasts would quickly leave. When you see venomous serpents and scorpions, you can call Bodhisattva Guanyin's name and praise her holy power, and they will go back into their lairs. When lightning and thunder strike the ground, and hail and heavy rain start pouring down, one can call Bodhisattva Guanyin's name and praise her holy power, so that the bad weather would stop and disappear. For all living creatures, there are so many difficulties, but the holy and wonderful power from Bodhisattva Guanyin will help us get through all of them. The voice reading the scripture was very sincere and earnest. Ling Huchang knew straight away that it was Yi Lin who was praying to Guanyin for his well-being. Many days ago, in the outskirts of Hangshan City, Yi Lin had once read the scripture to him. This time, he didn't turn his head around to have a look, but he remembered clearly what Yi Lin looked like on that day long ago, when her eyes were full of love and her beautiful face looked soft and warm. A soft and warm feeling bubbled up inside his heart. Not only Ying Ying, martial sister Yi Lin also regards me more important than their own lives. Even if my body were grounded to dust and all my bones were broken, it would still be hard for me to repay their kindness. Zuo Langchan saw Yue Buchun's sword was across his chest, while his left hand was in a sword form, poised for writing letters. Zuo Langchan knew his sword was a Huashan sword art called Poetry Sword to Meet Friends. It was the stance Huashan School used when having a friendly fight against people from the orthodox path. The meaning behind this move was when cultured men make friends, they combine sentences together to make poems, while when martial men make friends, they compare martial skills. When this move was used, it made it clear that there was no enmity between the opponents, so the sword fight should only decide the winner and loser, and mustn't take each other's lives. There was a smile on the corner of Zuo Langchan's mouth as he said, "No need to be polite." While he thought, Yue Buchun is praised as a gentleman, but I see he's more of a hypocrite. It's not necessarily because of his good heart that he's not showing any kind of hostility towards me. One, he might be afraid. Second, he's trying to make me bold and careless so that he can try to catch me off guard and kill me. Zuo Langchan pointed his left hand out to the side while his right hand aimed the long sword forward. This move was Songshan School's sword art called Opening the Gate to See the Mountain. He used this sword move to say, if you want to fight, then fight. there's no need to be putting on air, and it also implied that his opponent was a hypocrite. All right, how about give me 5 minutes? All right, 5-minute break, and I'll be right back. All right, Daddy's back. You guys like my Yilin voice? It's the same as my Hinata voice. Naruto-kun. All right, so the fight is about to start, right? Fight between Yue Buchun and Zuo Langchan. Let's see how it goes. Yue Buchun let out a sigh and thrust his longsword forward, with the points of the sword continuously trembling. When the sword reached midway, it suddenly turned around and shot up, changing into the Huashan sword art concealed green mountain. The sword point was vague, like it was there and it wasn't there, as it fluctuated endlessly. Zuo Langchan slashed down powerfully in an earth-shaking, imposing manner. Many of the spectators gasped and cried out. Originally, this move didn't exist as part of the Songshan sword art, but Zuo Langchan borrowed a stance from the bare-handed martial art and used his sword like it was his fist. This move, split Huashan open, was very ordinary and was thoroughly understood by everyone who had ever studied bare-handed martial art before. He named his move Split Huashan Open. Oh, that's kind of telling, isn't it? The 5 mountain sword schools had been communicating with each other for several hundred years already. So not only Songshan's sword art didn't have this move, even if it existed, with Huashan School's name in its name, they probably wouldn't have used it, or maybe they would have changed its form. At this time, Zuo Langchan had intentionally changed this existing bare-handed martial art into a sword move to infuriate Yue Buchun. Songshan's sword art always looked grand, and when he used this ordinary move, Split Huashan Open, it still looked like it could split mountain and still unleash the power of Songshan's sword art. Yue Buchun leaned to a side to dodge it, while thrusting his sword slantingly, using the move Forest of Ancient Pine. Zuo Langchan saw his movement was tight and cautious, like it wasn't seeking for a result, but to avoid making a mistake, and it was precisely the method to use when having a long fight. It was obvious Yue Buchun wasn't feeling angry from the two movements, opening the gate to see the mountain and split Huashan open that Zuo Langchan used. Zuo Langchan appraised his opponent was a strong enemy, and if he kept on fighting him contemptuously, randomly using new moves, then he would have given him too much advantage. So he immediately slashed his longsword from left to right, using Songshan School's real sword art, Jade Dragon Outside of Heaven. Songshan disciples had all learned this move, but who could have used it in such a surging and grand manner? As Zuo Langchan's longsword traversed through the air, it looked bent and straight, like it was something alive, and the disciples all cheered loudly. From the moment the heroes of the other schools arrived at Mount Songshan, they had been watching the Songshan school people beating drums, releasing firecrackers, and applauding Zuo Langchan no matter what he said. So everyone in the crowd felt at least some loathing in their heart. But this time, when they heard Songshan disciples cheering loudly, they felt that it was reasonable, so they also cheered. This move of Jade Dragon Outside of Heaven, executed by Zuo Langchan, looked as if a spirit snake or a divine dragon came to life. Regardless of whether they used sword or other weapons, the people in the crowd all sighed in praise. When the old masters of Taishan and Hangshan School saw this move, they all couldn't help rejoicing. Lucky the one he's fighting up there is Yue Buchun and not me. Zhou Langchan and Yue Buchun were using their own schools' sword art to fight each other. Songshan's sword behaved more like a halberd. Its chi was very thick, akin to 1,000 soldiers and 10,000 horses rushing forth, scattering yellow dust from thousands of li away. Huashan's sword was light and lively, like a pair of swallows flying amongst the willow during the springtime, going high and low, left and right, and flying around. In that moment, even though Yue Buchun didn't look like he was going to lose, the Songshan sword chi from the sword arts' most offensive moves was slashing everywhere on top of the place of worship. That Yue Buchun tried not to clash his longsword with his opponent's sword the entire time. It was evident that even though his sword art was wonderful, it was only relying on agility and therefore not a match for the powerful Songshan sword art. It seemed the two of them were masters of the martial study, so as they competed swords, there was no fixed path or structure that they followed. Zhuo Langchan used the 17 sword paths of the Songshan sword art, all mixed together. Yue Buchun used fewer sword stances, but Huashan's sword art had many complicated variations, and the moves also came out one after another, effortlessly. After trading more than 20 moves, Zhuo Langchan suddenly lifted the longsword in his right hand while his left palm fiercely struck out. This palm enveloped 36 fatal acupoints on his opponent's upper body, and if Yue Buchun were to dodge it, he would immediately be pierced by the sword. But Yue Buchun's face turned purple as he gathered his chi and shot his left palm out to clash palms with Zhuo Langchan. With a thunderous sound, the two palms clashed. Yue Buchun flew back, but Zhuo Langchan just stood there, motionless. Sound effect doesn't quite match, but get the idea. Yue Buchun called out, "Is that palm move Songshan martial art?" Ling Huchang was deeply concerned. When he saw the two of them had clashed palms, he knew Zhuo Langchan's polar ice energy was very formidable. Even Ranwo Singh, with his deep and abundant internal energy, was in a very dangerous situation after being hit by it, and it unexpectedly made the four of them into snowmen. So it's funny, when they clashed palms, only Yue Buchun flew back, right? But Zhuo Langchan stood there like he was he was a boss. Even though Yue Buchun had been cultivating his chi for a long time, it still wasn't as good as Ranwo Singh. So, if they were to clash palms a few more times, even if he didn't turn into a frozen corpse, it was certain that he wouldn't be able to endure it. Zhuo Langchan smilingly said, This is the palm move I created. I'll pick a disciple from the 5-mountain school and impart this skill to him in the future. I'll have to ask Brother Zhuo for some pointers then, Yue Buchun replied. Very good, Zhuo Langchan replied, while he thought, his Huashan school's divine art of violet twilight is also very good. After he received my polar ice energy palm, he could speak without quivering. Zhuo Langchan immediately wielded his longsword and thrust it towards Yue Buchun. Yue Buchun counterattacked with his sword. After many moves, a crashing sound was heard, and they again clashed palms. Yue Buchun's longsword circled and slashed out at Zhuo Langchan's waist. Zhuo Langchan blocked it with a vertical sword move and moved his chi into his left palm and struck out at the back of Yue Buchun's body. This downward palm strike had a powerful force and was wonderfully positioned. Yue Buchun turned his left palm around, and with a light clapping sound, they clashed palms for the third time. Yue Buchun lowered his body to fly out, but Zhuo Langchan felt an aching pain in the middle of his left palm. He lifted his palm to have a look and saw there was a small hole there with black blood seeping out. Half startled and half angry, he scolded, Crafty thief! Shameless! He was thinking Yue Buchun must have concealed a poisonous needle in his palm, and this had pierced the middle of his palm when he suddenly clashed. The blood seeping out of it had already turned black from poison. He never thought this person with the nickname Gentleman's Sword would actually have such a contemptible conduct. He inhaled a breath of air and tapped 3 acupoints on his left shoulder with his right finger to stop the poison from going up. He thought, such a trivial poison needle, how can it stop me? But I must fight with him quickly and mustn't let him drag it along. Holy hand is his holy hand strike. He promptly attacked with his sword like a blast of rain. Yue Buchun wielded his sword to counterattack. His sword moves had also changed into very violent moves. At this time, the evening had just set in, and the fight between these two people on the place of worship couldn't be seen that clearly anymore. But it was still easy to see by everyone gathered around the place of worship that the fight had turned deadly. Great Master Feng Zhang said, "Mercy, mercy. Why did you suddenly turn so violent?" After more than 10 moves, Zuo Langchan felt the poison on his palm spreading up while his opponent's defense remained very tight, so he kept on increasing the force of his sword. Yue Buchun was finding it hard to keep up and seemed like he was unable to keep blocking anymore. Suddenly, Yue Buchun changed his swordplay. Now his sword was suddenly extending and withdrawing, and the stances looked really strange and weird. The crowd below the place of worship was surprised, and one by one whispered to each other, "What sword art is this?" The people being asked were asking back, and everyone was just shaking their heads without being able to summon up an answer. Ling Wuchang had been leaning on Ying Ying when he suddenly saw his master's swordplay becoming both fast and weird, and very different from the sword art of Huashan school. He was surprised. He then glanced around and saw that Zuo Langchan's swordplay had also changed. Now Zuo Langchan was using sword moves which were unexpectedly very similar to the ones his master were using. The two of them were attacking and defending very quickly, and the swordplay coordination between the two of them was seamless, as if they were martial brothers who had been practicing this set of sword arts together for dozens of years already. In the next 20 moves, Zuo Langchan kept on advancing with each of his moves, while Yue Buchun continuously retreated. Ling Wuchang was very good at looking at flaws in other people's martial art, so he was getting really anxious when he saw the flaws in his master's swordplay getting bigger and bigger, while the situation was getting more and more dangerous. Seeing that Zuo Langchan's win was guaranteed, Songshan school disciples cried out in joy. Zuo Langchan's attacks were swift and continuous. When he saw his opponent's swordplay was disorderly and that within 10 moves he would be able to disarm him, he became happy and he hurriedly increased the strength of his attack. Sure enough, as his sword slash was blocked by Yue Buchun, he felt the strength in Yue Buchun's arm was quite weak. Zuo Langchan twirled his sword quickly, and Yue Buchun was unable to hold on to his sword as it was sent shooting up into the sky. Songshan school disciples cheered thunderously. Suddenly, Yue Buchun rushed forward with his bare hands. Both of his hands attacked ruthlessly, with seizing, stabbing, and slapping strikes. His body was floating like a ghost, shifting here and there. He shifted to the west, while his hand unthinkably attacked quickly and strangely. Zuo Langchan was astonished and called out, This! And exerted himself to block. Yue Buchun's longsword had dropped straight into the place of worship, penetrating the ground, but no one paid any attention to it. "Dongfang Bu Bai," Ying Ying whispered. Ling Wuchang was also thinking of the same thing. The move his master used at that moment was the same martial art that Dongfang Bu Bai had used with the embroidering needle when fighting against the 4 of them. He was so astonished that he forgot about his injury and stood up. From beside him, a small hand extended itself to hold him underneath the armpit, but he was completely oblivious to it. A pair of startled, tender eyes were looking at him, but he didn't notice that either. At that time, from among the thousands of people on the Songshan mountaintop, there was only this pair of eyes that wasn't looking at the fight between Zuo Langchan and Yue Buchun. From the beginning of the fight, Yi Lin had never taken her eyes off Ling Hucheng. Zhu Langchan cried out ferociously, and Yue Buchun flew out to stand on the southwest corner of the place of worship. Yue Buchun was only about a foot away from the edge, and his body was faltering, looking like he was about to fall off the place of worship. The long sword in Zhuo Langchan's right hand was still dancing, and it was getting faster and faster. The moves he used were Songshan's sword art. Every single move was protecting the fatal acupoints on his entire body. His sword art was wonderful, and its power ferocious, and each slash of the sword reverberated with the sound of wind generated by it. A lot of people were exclaiming loudly in praise. After a time, they realized that Zhuo Langchan was just brandishing his sword around his own body, and never advanced to attack Yue Buchun. Something wasn't right. His swordplay was only defending, and there wasn't even half a move attacking Yue Buchun. With this kind of swordplay, it looked like he was just practicing his swordplay. How could he cope with an attack from a strong opponent? Suddenly, Zhuo Langchan's sword pierced forward and stopped in midair. He leaned his head slightly to one side, looking like he was trying to listen to some strange noise. The crowd saw a thin line of blood flowing from both of his eyes down to his cheeks and were dripping from his chin. From the crowd, someone exclaimed, "He's blind!" Ah! Okay. So you haven't noticed? Like, shit just kind of got real. Yeah, shit's getting intense. So apparently, Yue Buchun was using Dongfang Bubai's, the martial art that looks like Dongfang Bubai's martial art, right? And it's weird, how does he know it? And he also blinded freaking Zhuo Langchan. This voice wasn't very loud, but Zhuo Langchan angrily shouted, "I'm not blind! I'm not blind! Which dog said I'm blind? Yue Buchun, you traitor! If you've got guts, then come fight with your grandpa for 300 more stances!" His voice was getting louder and louder, and his voice was full of anger, pain, and hopelessness. It was just like a beast that had been mortally wounded, roaring loudly in its death throes. Yue Buchun was smiling as he stood at the corner of the place of worship. When everyone had seen clearly that both of Zhuo Langchan's eyes had been blinded by Yue Buchun, they were all in utter disbelief. Only Ling Hucheng and Ying Ying were not surprised by this. After Yue Buchun had lost his longsword, the technique he used afterwards was very similar to the one Dongfang Bubai used. That day on Dark Wood Cliff, Runwal Singh, Ling Hucheng, Xiang Wentian, and Shangguan Yun cooperated together to fight Dongfang Bubai, but they were still not his match. Only after Ying Ying turned around to attack Yang Lianting that they were luckily spared. And even then, at the end, Runwal Singh was still blinded in one eye. At that time, there was only a thin line difference between life and death for all of them. When Yue Buchun's body started to float rapidly, even though he wasn't as good as Dongfang Bubai, it became certain that Zhuo Langchan would still lose when fighting him one-on-one. As expected, not long after, both of Zhuo Langchan's eyes were blinded by a needle. You kind of feel sorry for Chief Zhuo? Really? Nah. I don't feel sorry at all. I don't feel sorry at all. He schemed and schemed for years and years, and now look where it got him. No mercy, guys. No mercy. Ling Hucheng wasn't happy at all to see that his master won. Instead, he suddenly felt indescribable fear in his heart. Yue Buchun's temper had always been peaceful and calm, and he had always treated Ling Hucheng amiably. Ling Hucheng had always regarded his master with affection and awe. Later on, when his master expelled him from the school, he knew that it was because of his own faults. He felt it was a deserved punishment in reality because he liked to handle things eccentrically, unreasonably, and do as he pleased. He was only hoping that master and master wife would be able to forgive him, and he had no anger towards them at all. But when he saw master standing at the edge of the place of worship with his sleeves floating in the wind and his manner elegant and scholarly, without knowing why, an intense feeling of hatred rose up in his heart. Finally, Jesus. Perhaps it was because the martial art Yue Buchun used had made him thought of Dongfang Bubai's grotesqueness, or perhaps he felt master had won in an extremely dishonorable and unscrupulous manner. He was at a loss for some time when his wound suddenly became painful and he sat down dejectedly. Ying Ying and Yilin extended their hands at the same time to support him while asking, "What's wrong?" Ling Huchong shook his head and forced a smile. Nothing. They again heard Zuo Langchan cry out, "Yue Buchun, you traitor! If you got guts, come out and fight to the death, running here and there. What a disgraceful bastard! You, come and fight!" Tang Ying Ge from the Songshan school said, "Go up there and help master come down." Yes, two disciples, Xing Xu Dengda and Du Xu answered. They flew up the place of worship and said, "Master, let's go down." "Yue Buchun, you're afraid to come?" Zuo Langchan shouted. Xu Dengda extended his hand to help. Meh. Suddenly, a light reflected. Zuo Langchan slashed his longsword from Xu Dengda's left shoulder to his right waist, and followed by slashing at Di Sui Ying's chest. These two attacks were very formidable, and the end was unthinkable. In a flash, the two Songshan school disciples had been chopped into 4 pieces. The crowd below gasped in fright, stunned. Killed his 2 disciples. Not cool, dude. Both are cunning men, to be honest. Yeah, they're both very scheming. Maybe because you hate Yue Buchun more now with how he treated Ling Huchong. Yeah, maybe. Yue Buchun slowly walked towards the middle of the place of worship and said, "Brother Zuo, you're already handicapped, so I won't fight you anymore. Are you still thinking of fighting me for the headmaster position of the 5 Mountains School?" Zuo Langchan slowly lifted his longsword and pointed the sword at Yue Buchun's chest. Yue Buchun had no weapon in his hand. His longsword, which had fallen from midair, was still penetrated on the floor of the place of worship and was now slightly swaying in the wind. Yue Buchun inserted both of his hands into his sleeves, while both of his eyes stared unblinkingly at the sword point, just 3 feet away from his chest. The blood on the sword point was dripping onto the ground with a light tap, tap, tap sound. The sleeve on Zuo Langchan's right hand started to puff up like a sail gathering up wind. The sleeve on his left hand drooped down and looked ordinary, which indicated that he had concentrated his whole energy into his right arm. The stirring of his internal energy made his sleeve billow. This was not a small thing at all. It signaled that this attack would be as powerful as a thunderbolt when released. Suddenly, a white blur was seen as Yue Buchun slid back more than 10 feet and in a blink had come back to where he was standing. This retreat and return was done with such speed that it took only an instant. He just stood there for a moment before sliding to the left and back for more than 10 feet, and just like before, swiftly returned to his original place to face Zuo Langchan's sword. Everyone had all seen it clearly. No matter how fierce or formidable Zuo Langchan's attack would be, he still wouldn't be able to hit Yue Buchun. Zhuo Longchan was confusedly thinking of many things. Confusedly. If his Qian Kun toss didn't pierce Yue Buchun's chest, and Yue Buchun managed to avoid it, then with his two blind eyes he would be prey to Yue Buchun without being able to fight back. He then thought of all the efforts he had put into the planning of the merger of the 5 schools. He never expected that everything would have come to nothing. He had failed when success was just within his reach. Instead, he had fallen into a plot. Suddenly, his heart turned sour, and he felt warm blood rushing up. With a cry, fresh blood sprayed out from his mouth. Yue Buchun leaned slightly to one side and evaded the blood. His face was showing a smiling expression. Zhuo Longchan shook out his right hand, and the longsword broke in the middle. He immediately followed it by throwing it onto the ground. He looked up and laughed loudly, the sound of his laughter reverberating far throughout the valley. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. While still laughing, he turned his body around and strode purposefully off the place of worship. When he reached the edge of the place of worship, his left feet stepped in midair, but he was ready for this, as his right leg kicked out and he flew down the place of worship. A few disciples of Songshan School rushed forward and called out, "Master, we'll go together and chop up everyone from the Huashan School." Zhuo Longchan said in a clear voice, "Gentlemen's words must be believed. It's already said it's a sword fight to take the leadership, and it will only depend on martial art to gain victory. Mr. Yue's martial art has gained him victory from me, so everyone must now accept him as headmaster. How can you have thoughts of dissent?" When his eyes were first blinded, he was startled and angry and couldn't help hurling abuses, but after he had calmed down a bit, he regained the aura of a master and was very firm, resembling a grand hero. The entire crowd really admired him for this. Otherwise, with countless numbers of Songshan School disciples here and their many helpers, along with the advantage they held, if they actually fought with Huashan School's people, no matter how high Yue Buchun's martial art was, it would still be very hard to match the strength of the Songshan School. Among the people who had come to Mount Songshan to mingle with the 5 mountains sword schools, many of them were there to curry favor with people higher than them. So when they heard what Zhuo Longchan said, they immediately cheered. "Let Mr. Yue be the 5 mountain school headmaster! Let Mr. Yue be the 5 mountain school headmaster!" The disciples of the Huashan School exclaimed even louder. Actually, this outcome was really outside their expectations, and the disciples of the Huashan School could hardly believe that this had happened. Yue Buchun walked to the edge of the place of worship and folded his hands in salute. When Brother Zhuo and I were comparing our skills, we originally weren't going to hurt each other, but Martial Brother Zhuo's martial art was just too high, and he shook out the longsword out of my hand. So in desperation, I was just trying to protect myself and lost my discretion and resulted in harming Martial Brother Zhuo's eyes. My heart feels very uneasy about this. Let's look for a good doctor to treat Martial Brother Zhuo. Someone below said, "The blade has no eyes. How can it prevent injuries?" Another person said, "You didn't keep going and kill him. That's very righteous." "I don't believe it," Yue Buchun humbly replied. He was still cupping his hand in salute without talking, and he also didn't have any intention of going down the place of worship. Someone below shouted, "Whoever wants to become the 5 Mountain School headmaster, go up and fight." Another person said, "Anyone with too bright of eyes, go up and ask Mr. Yue to dig it out. That will be all right." Hundreds of people called out in unison, "Mr. Yue, be the 5 Mountain School headmaster! Mr. Yue, be the 5 Mountain School headmaster!" Yue Buchun waited for the clamor to calm down slightly before saying in a clear voice, "Since it's everyone's wish, I don't dare to decline. Today is the inauguration of the 5 Mountain School, so there's no set rules yet. I'll just follow the existing hierarchy. The matters in Hengshan, I'd like to ask Mr. Mo Da to preside over them. The affairs in Hangshan will still be managed by my brother Ling Hu Chong. The matters of Taishan, I'd like to ask Priest Yu Qing and Priest Yu Yin to get together with one of the foundation principal. No, wait. I'd like to ask Priest Yu Qing and Priest Yu Yin to get together with one of the foundation disciples of Martial Brother Tian Men to preside over the school. For the affairs of the Songshan School, Martial Brother Zuo's eyes are an inconvenience, but it must be considered. Yue Buchun paused for a while as his eyes ranged over the cluster of Songshan School people. Then he slowly said, in my opinion, I'd like to ask Martial Brother Tang Yingge and Martial Brother Lu Bai to preside over the daily matters of Songshan, together with Martial Brother Zuo for the time being. Yeah, Yue Buchun must be really happy at this moment. This was really beyond Lu Bai's expectation, and he stammered, This. The people of the Songshan school, along with the people from the other schools, were surprised to hear this. Tang Yingge had been Zuo Langchan's second in command for a long time, so it was expected. But Lu Bai had just made things difficult for Yue Buchun by coldly ridiculing and hotly satirizing him. He never expected Yue Buchun to forget all he did and appoint him to be one of the people to preside over Songshan School affairs. The disciples of the Songshan School were originally furious over the blinding of Zuo Langchan's eyes, and many of them wished for an opportunity to arise to repay him in kind. But hearing Yue Buchun sending Tang Yingge, Lu Bai, and Zuo Langchan to preside over Songshan's matters, just as it were in its original state, they felt that Yue Buchun was not imposing his will on them by force, and their anger was somewhat cooled. Yue Buchun said, Today our 5 mountain sword schools have merged. If we don't get along well, then this merger of the 5 schools will just be in words, and will only be an empty name. From today onwards, everyone is in the same school and must get along well with each other. I have no virtue and no ability, and only temporarily hold the headmaster position of the 5 Mountains School, so I must discuss with all the brothers here on all sorts of things. I don't dare to do it on my own. It's already night now, and everyone is exhausted. Let us all go to Songshan's courtyard to rest, drink wine, and have some meals. The crowd cheered, and one by one went down the mountaintop. As Yue Buchun descended from the place of worship, Great Master Fang Zhang, Priest Changshu, and the other masters came over to congratulate him. Fang Zhang and Changshu were originally worried that once Zuo Langchan had merged the 5 schools, his wild ambition would continue and he would want to annex Shaolin and Wudang and bring disaster upon Wulin. Everyone knew that Yue Buchun was a modest gentleman, so they were relieved that he was wielding the power of the merged schools, and their congratulations to him were sincere. Really? Great Master Fang Zhang whispered, Mr. Yue, at this moment, the intentions of the disciples of the Songshan School are unpredictable, and they're not favorable towards Shi Zhu. As the saying goes, we must not harbor ill intention towards other people, but we must guard ourselves. Shi Zhu must be careful while you're on Mount Songshan. Shi Zhu just means like a normal person, I believe. Like a person who's not a monk. Yes, thank you for Great Master Abbot's advice, Yue Buchun replied. Mount Shaoshi is just a doorstep away from here and is very easy to answer to your call, Fang Zhang said. Yue Buchun saluted deeply by cupping his hands and said, I'll remember Great Master's kind intention with gratitude. Then he spoke a few words with Priest Changshu and Beggar Clan's leader Xie before quickly going over to Ling Hu Chong and asking, Chonger, is your wound all right? Since the moment he expelled Ling Hucheng from Huashan, this was the first time he called him Chang'er in such a pleased and warm manner. But Ling Hucheng's heart was cold as he tremblingly said, It's not serious. Why don't you come back to Huashan with me to take care of your injury and get together with your master wife again? Yue Buchun asked. If Yue Buchun had asked this a few hours earlier, Ling Hucheng would have been madly happy and would have immediately agreed. But now he hesitated and was rather quite afraid to go up Huashan. So? Yue Buchun asked. Hangshan School has good medicine. One's disciple's injury is better. I'll come and visit master and master wife, Ling Hucheng replied. Yue Buchun turned his head slightly and gazed at his face, looking like he wanted to discover his real intention. After some time, he said, That's also good. Set your mind at ease and take care of your injury. I hope you can visit Huashan soon. Yes, Ling Hucheng responded as he struggled to stand up to give his propriety. Yue Buchun extended his hand to hold Ling Hucheng's right hand and warmly said, There's no need. Ling Hucheng contracted his body away from Yue Buchun's hand while his face couldn't help showing his fear. Yue Buchun snorted and scowled angrily, but then immediately smiled and sighed. Your little martial sister is still like before. She still doesn't know how soft or hard to be when she attacks. Luckily, you didn't get stabbed on your fatal acupoint. He then nodded towards Yihe and Yiqing, who were the two most senior disciples, and slowly turned around. He walked towards a group of hundreds of people waiting for him. As he neared, those people surrounded him and praised his high martial art, his righteousness, and his appropriate handling of the matters. Crowding around him and flattering him continuously, they all went down from the mountaintop. Ling Hucheng kept an eye on the back of his master's body until he disappeared from his view. The people from each school had also gone down from the mountaintop. Suddenly he heard a female voice at his back utter, Hypocrite. Ling Hucheng faltered as his wound pained sharply, and this word hypocrite was like a big hammer. And this word hypocrite was like a big hammer pounding on his chest. All of a sudden, he felt he couldn't draw his breath anymore. And we're done. All right, that was a big chapter. Did you guys like that? You guys like that in chat? So it seems like his master, Yue Buchun, had been planning this for a long time, right? Yeah, he's actually pretty smart because he used Zhuo Langchan's plan to benefit himself, right? So while everyone was suspicious of Zhuo Langchan, it was really Yue Buchun they should have been suspicious of. And for some reason, the master Fang Zheng and the other the big people in the martial arts world, they still trust Yue Buchun, which doesn't make any sense. Yeah, and there's a mystery that was that was revealed. Oh, was it revealed? Well, we were introduced to a mystery. For some reason, Yue Buchun knows how to use the martial arts of Dongfang Bubai. And we don't know how, right? That's what he used to blind Zhuo Langchan. The girl voice is the best. Naruto-kun, Naruto-kun. All right. Let's take a drink of some wine and then we can finish. I think we're done. That was a pretty big chapter. We're at the home stretch, guys. We're almost finished with the story. Yeah. Like the intensity ramps up from this point, right? It's gonna keep going up and up and up and up. Oh god. All right, cheers. My reading skills are very good. Yeah, I can read. I've been to school. I've been to school. I've been to high school. So I can read. I've been reading my whole life. No. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming. I hope you liked this chapter. I hope you'll tune in for the next chapter. And thanks for joining. I love you. Bye.